We are a people at the full height of our power. This is the place, and now is the hour.
Welcome, everybody. Wow. All right, 10:01. I want to say, woo, take a big inhale, big exhale, because one of the things that we talked about in our last session was how jolting all of this is for your central nervous system. And even just this morning, in order for all of us to just take in dance teaching, really just take a deep breath, a big inhale and exhale, and like, we're here because we want to work on the strategic long haul. And what I realized right away was that all the back and forth and all the vitriol and all the things our president does is so jolting for my nervous system that I have to focus on strategic actions that will be effective.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Sheridan. You're amazing. Today, we get to talk about something that I think is one of the really major factors of any successful nonviolent action or movement, but unfortunately is often neglected. And that is what Gandhi called constructive program. So just a quick, short definition of constructive program is it is democracy in action. It is living the democracy now, even in the midst of repression, that we want to live into for the rest of our lives and hand off to our children. Another way to think about this is nonviolent campaigns are a function of resist and replace. We hear a lot of emphasis on resistance, and that's obviously very important. And we've been spending a lot of time so far in these sessions talking about how civil resistance works, why nonviolence works, how to build strategies, and so on. But if we only are putting our emphasis on resistance and on the nonviolent processes of dismantling structures of oppression, then we're missing a major piece of the overall puzzle. So we want to talk about resist and replace. And we don't wait for success to replace the structures that we want to dismantle or reform, is more often the case. We want to begin that now. So constructive program is always a feature of any nonviolent movement, really from the get-go. We want to be thinking about that from the very beginning. So resist and replace is another way to think about this, is that we are shifting from being against something to being for something. So both are important. We know what we're against. We are shocked and appalled by a lot of what's going on. But we also want to keep our eye on what we're for, what it is we're promoting, what do we want, what kind of a civil society do we want to create? So that's why we call this session, don't just burn it down, build it up. Or don't burn it down at all, but build it up. So just let's briefly come back to our power model. You know, as we said at the beginning, this is a model we'll come back to over and over again. I don't know if that's handy, Sheridan, you could bring it up. But just as a reminder, we are talking about a kind of power model that really illustrates in dramatic form a fundamental feature of political reality, and that is that power always flows upward. The illusion is that it's flowing down, top down, but in fact, it's bottom up. The only reason power works top down is because we give it our consent, is because we agree to that. There you go. So let's just take a quick look at this. We've been using this model as a strategy model for figuring out where some of those pillars of support are vulnerable to pressure and building our actions around uh, the the best possibility that we have for wiggling one of those supports or even removing it. And that obviously, if you just look at the model, you can see if you take enough of those away, that inverted pyramid is very unstable. It will simply topple over. And that's how we build nonviolent pressure. It's how we create what we call nonviolent coercion. It's building that kind of nonviolent power is what gives us some room at the negotiating table. 9 times out of 10, we're not interested in replacing this structure. We want good governmental structures. So we want to create supports that keep those in place. And mostly what we're looking for is reform. We're not really looking for revolution. If you understand revolution as a dismantling of the structure and creating a new structure of government from the bottom up, well, that's not what we're about here because we have a democracy, we have a constitution. The problem is not that our form of government, that there's something wrong with our form of government. The problem is that the power holders within those structures are not following the rules. So we're not really interested in revolution in the sense of dismantling the fundamental structures of government. What we're interested in is using those structures to force change. So democracy or constructive program, I'm kind of using those terms interchangeably, is about using that model not just to withdraw your support, which is what it says here, that's what we're doing with nonviolent strategy, but if we could even use that same model and said, give it your support. What is it that you want to support? What is it that you want to put your energies into? Yeah, nonviolent struggle is powerful means for those struggling for freedom. And it is also the most powerful means that we have to support civil society. So you could say that constructive program is democracy in action. Constructive program is a nonviolent training ground for people coming along who are learning the processes of democracy. So I think I've shown you this book by Erica Chenoweth, Why Civil Resistance Works. She's got a whole section in there about why it sometimes fails. And one of the major features of nonviolent failure is when we fail to build a broad enough power base. So when we're looking at constructive program, we are looking at building a democracy that is a diverse collection of voices who learn how to be in productive communication with each other so that we can create the kind of society that we want. It's not about agreement across the board. One of the things that the us versus them model sometimes unconsciously proposes is that the goal is sameness. The goal is agreement. The goal is getting everybody on the same page in terms of policy positions and that sort of thing. Well, democracy doesn't work that way. What we're looking for in democracy is creative communication and conversation across diversity. How to do that without violence so that together we can create a functioning government that really works well at building coalitions and negotiating for change. That's how democracy works. So what we want to do with constructive program is to enact that at the very beginning. Let's enact it in our nuclear families. Let's enact it in our school systems. Let's enact it in our churches. Let's enact a bold, courageous, risk-taking communication strategy that allows us to each speak authentically in the voice that is truly our own, with the trust that we can both hear and be heard across difference. That's the ideal. Obviously, we've got a long way to go, but we need to keep working at that. Okay, one of the difficulties often with nonviolent campaigns and nonviolent movements is that we get caught up in the urgency of the moment. And so we kind of get tunnel vision. And that's part of the reason why in the second session, we spent a fair amount of time talking about internal regulations so that we are coming from a place of creative response as opposed to just reactivity. It's very easy to get caught up in urgency. I don't know about all you, but I read Heather Cox Richardson and I love what she puts out there. It's so full of useful information. But when I finish reading that and I just check in with my nervous system, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. So we have to really step away from some of that reactivity so that we can shift into a more creative place of response. So, the analogy here is it's like, if we're not prepared for success by visioning this movement beyond resistance, we're like a dog chasing a car, we're so caught up in the moment of needing to resist and caught up in the urgency of the moment that we're caught flat-footed when success comes, right? So it's the old thing about what is the dog going to do when it catches the car? It doesn't know what to do. So it's all about the chase. So we want to be thinking beyond just chasing the car. We want to think to the point of success. Hard to do, isn't it? When it looks like so much terrible stuff is coming along. Yeah, there you go. Be careful what you wish for. So constructive program, I love this image that Sheridan came up with. Constructive program is that guy sitting on his box thinking, I don't know what it is I'm catching, but whatever it is, I want to be ready for it when it gets hooked. So we may not know what's underneath there, what's coming, but we want to be able to think as carefully as we can about what we're going to do when we get what we wish for, because we wish for it, right? That's why we do this stuff. We are doing it because we want this to succeed. So let's prepare for success. That's what constructive program begins to think. So as many people as you have in your activist groups who are thinking about nonviolent strategy, who are thinking about creating the next action, who are building the grassroots movement, who are staying on top of policy moves and so on, you need to have certainly a dedicated portion of your activist group thinking about constructive program. Let me give you a medical analogy. We can't all be ER docs. Some of us have to be general practitioners, taking care of business in spite of what's going on in the emergency room. So one way to think about that is don't just make heroes out of the people who are doing civil disobedience. Let's make heroes out of people who are home taking care of the kids and making dinner. Those folks are as heroic as the folks on the picket line. Those are the folks who are doing the constructive program of living into the democracy that we want, the functioning society. So we also need research docs. So we need ER docs, we need GPs, and we need research docs. Okay, so who are the research docs? Those are the ones who are thinking up the next cure for cancer or whatever they can come up with for a new vaccine. Well, if we're not prepared for that, we could be in a world of hurt. So we want people who are thinking about what is the civil society that we want post-Trump? He'll be gone eventually, hopefully sooner. Well, what do we want? Not only just who do we want to put in office, who do we want to get elected, but how do we want to create an even more participatory democracy than what we already have? So we need people thinking about that. And that obviously involves organizing as well as people who really want to dig into policy. Okay, so what does success look like? That's the question that constructive program is asking. So another reason why this is so important, and it challenges one of the assumptions that I think many of us make, and that is our progress toward success is linear. It takes place in predictable stages and so on. We did talk about stages of movements, but stages of movements are not necessarily like stair steps. Some of you maybe have read Malcolm Gladwell's book on the tipping point. Well, one of the things that he says in that book is that the tipping point really can be understood in three aspects of that. One is he calls it contagion. And so contagion, that's his virus analogy, is about spreading the movement, growing the grassroots movement in a way that can suddenly take off. It's not necessarily a gentle progression, but it can suddenly take off. He also makes the point that small causes can have big effects. And that's often something we don't realize. We think it's got to be a big splash in order to make a big result, but sometimes it's the small thing that actually tips the scale. And so we want to keep that in mind, that success can be a matter of contagion, and it can also be a matter of small actions making a big success. So yeah, look at this point. If you're on the left side of that curve, you're pushing that rock up that hill, you can't really see when that tipping point is going to occur. All you can see is the underside of that rock. You're pushing it, you're working at it, but you don't know when that tipping point is going to come. So we need to be able to anticipate and think ahead and be prepared for success for when that does come. Otherwise, you're like that guy on the right who's trying to just get out of the way. So that's a great image. The tipping point is what happens, can happen in a single dramatic moment. Okay, let's keep that in mind because that's what makes it, and it kind of gets it more into the foreground of our strategic planning, that it's not only about dismantling structures or even reforming who's in them. It's about building something up and making sure that we're giving it all the support that it needs in order to be successful. So there are a number of principles involved in constructive program and in nonviolence in general. And one of the key points here is that the end is already embedded in the means. The end is already embedded in the means. So if you think about a lot of our reasoning about how to do things, there's a kind of a background assumption for a lot of us that the end justifies the means. That if it's a good end, then it doesn't matter so much how you get there. That is basically the moral reasoning behind militarism, is that nobody likes war, nobody wants to go to war, but we believe that the end, the goal of war, justifies the means that we use to get there. So with nonviolence, we're basically saying, and again, this is a pragmatic argument. I don't mean to frame this as a moral argument. That's a different conversation. But as a pragmatic argument, to operate on the idea that the end justifies the means is to embed in your ultimate success something that you are later going to have to undo and repair. So with military training, we're taking soldiers out of civil society, training them to inhabit a very different kind of culture in which violence is justified, and then returning them to civil society in which violence is now again illegal. So it's amazing to me why we don't have more instances of PTSD than we do. It's a testament to human resilience. So in nonviolent campaigns, we are not taking people out of civil society, training them in an alternative culture of violence, and then trying to repatriate and rehabilitate them in civil society. What we're doing is we are enacting the rules of civil society while we're in the very midst of the resistance movement. So I hope that point is clear, that what we are doing is insisting on a campaign in which the end, what it is we're trying to achieve, the success, the world we envision, is already being enacted in our very resistance work. It is embedded in the means that we use to get there.
So Dan, do we have an example of that?
Yeah, yeah. So, we have examples in a large scale way and also relatively small scale ways. So, for example, in the campaign for Indian independence from British colonialism, there were many aspects of constructive program that were part of that history. But one of the better known ones was Gandhi's insistence on homespun cloth. So it was called khadi. It was a kind of homespun cloth that everybody could make at home. And that had a number of features. One was that it was a boycott of British textiles, um, which had a monopoly on the Indian market. And so if nobody bought British textiles, that was essentially a boycott. That was only one of the features of it. It also became a symbol of national pride. Until then, the colonial subjects were wearing British style clothing. Well, khadi is a kind of garb that Indian nationals could identify as, hey, this is us. This is something that we're doing for ourselves. And so you've all seen these really interesting pictures of Gandhi wrapped in his khadi, standing amidst all these royal dressed British officials. You know, it's quite a contrast. And so it became a matter of Indian national pride that everybody was wearing khadi. It was also an activity that people could do on a daily basis. So if you're just sitting in your hut or your house spinning khadi, you could say, hey, I'm contributing to this massive movement of throwing off British oppression. So that's a way of saying we are living now the civil society that we want to eventually see. One of the points that Chenoweth and Stephan make in their book is that it is often the case that the failure to have a constructive program, to have a vision of what success looks like, can contribute to the failure of a nonviolent movement. You can have a very active resistance movement, and then suddenly you hit the tipping point, the dog catches the car, and you don't know what to do. And that can revert back into some old forms, just with different actors in place. So political systems in many respects are like family systems or language systems, that if you don't understand how the system works, it's very hard to just move the pieces around on the chessboard. So consider an alcoholic family, for example. If everybody is focused on the elephant in the room, I mean, you've got enablers, you've got people who are resisting it, you've got people who are just trying to escape and get away from it, and so on. But until you really change the fundamental dynamic of the system by getting into recovery, the system is going to revert to form, no matter how hard you try to change it. So what we're talking about on a large scale here is that we want to be prepared for success so that we don't just revert to form. And by reverting to form, I mean, in our case, since we're not really going to change the Constitution or our system of government, reverting to form might be something like continuing the expansion of executive power that Trump is working so hard to grow. So we don't want to elect a Democratic president who then just goes ahead and continues to have this expansive view of executive power. So we really need to be thinking about what is the system that we're part of, as well as who are the individuals occupying positions of power within them. So I hope that helps. That's what I mean by anticipating success. Don't just resist, but resist and replace. So Sheridan, if you could pull up that chart of the just a comparison of the two forms, that would be useful. I just created this brief chart. It's got 5 points. There could be many more, but I wanted us to contrast resistance movements where constructive program really has not been figured into the recipe from the beginning. I want to contrast that with nonviolent movements where constructive program is included in overall strategy. So as much as I'm an advocate for nonviolent action, simply as a strategy for political change, it is value neutral. Nonviolence in and of itself can be used by the right or the left. It can be used, it's simply a model of how political power works. And so it is essentially, in terms of its structure, it can be used by anyone. In fact, there have even been examples in history where both sides of a conflict were using nonviolent action. So it's important to bear in mind that we need more than just the political structures of resistance. So let's look at this. When constructive program is not included in the strategy, the focus is on the result. Well, how many of us can fall into that? That is super easy to think it's all about the results. So it requires a kind of a shift of perspective to step back and say, now, wait a minute, maybe we need to keep our focus more on how we get there than just getting there at whatever means. So when constructive program is included in the overall strategy, our focus is as much on the process of getting there as it is on the result. We are working at living into the democracy that we want to create while we're in the process of creating it. On the left side of that chart, so often the goal in resistance movements is undermining top-down power. Well, yes, absolutely. We've been talking about that. How do we work strategically in a way that begins to wobble those supports? That's how nonviolence works. When we marry that to constructive program, we're shifting our perspective ever so slightly to say that what we are doing here is not only undermining top-down power, we're also really working at building bottom-up power. And that's when we're really working on building our coalitions, learning how to communicate across diversity, learning how to do our negotiating and coalition building successfully. That's creating the democracy that we want to have.
You know, what I always think of about this is I have friends, acquaintances who very proudly proclaim I'm an anarchist. And, I'm like, so you want to tear it down? You want to undermine the top-down power? Like, I totally get that. And then what? Right?
Exactly.
The example
Exactly.
you were showing before. So also, it really strikes me that everything in the left-hand column,
Yeah.
it's very alpha, right?
Yeah.
It's all very alpha. It's all exactly what Donald Trump does, even though it does, right? It's a strategy.
Mhm.
He is using that strategy, us versus them. Everybody except for people that love me, they're your enemy. I'm right. It doesn't matter. Well, actually, the last one, he does care who likes him. He does care that he's liked. That's his right. That's his Achilles heel.
That's true. Yeah. So all of those points are right on, and we really want to pay attention to that. That the so often in the movement we can be blind to some of the difficulties in our process. We can allow our agreement on policy to blind us to our disagreement on process. So, sometimes in these discussions of political issues, we get so caught up in discussing the issues that and we love to do that. We love to be in the choir. We love to be with people who agree with us and who amplify our outrage and so on. But it's easy to lose sight of how we're going to get there and what is our underlying process for getting there. So often those conversations do fall into an us versus them kind of bit of rhetoric. And so democratic politics really is about we the people. In fact, I would love to see more of those kinds of messages on our signs. We the people. That's a phrase that everybody recognizes. It stands at the beginning of our governmental documents, and people use that phrase. So we, the people, believe in due process. We, the people, believe in the rule of law. That's a we message rather than an us versus them message. So that's just the third point on that chart, as opposed to the focus on being right, creating sameness, as opposed to focus on coalitions and creating community. Then the last one is on that left-hand side is results over relationships. That's end justifies the means kind of reasoning that I sacrifice justice in relationships in order to achieve the means, the end that I want. Well, on the right side of that chart, we really want to reverse that we achieve the end of just relationships by behaving justly in our relationships now. In other words, the process, I mean, just take your relationship with your partner. If you don't know how to have a good, healthy, creative argument, then you're not going to have a good, healthy, creative solution. So if you are particularly hurtful in the ways that you're relating to each other when you're triggered and you're in an argument, you're going to have to repair that. Well, why create something you have to repair? It's better to be a good listener and to really pay good attention to how you're relating to your partner now, so that when you do finally come to a place of a resolution of whatever the disagreement is about, you haven't sown the seeds of something that has to then be repaired later. So if that's true in a partnership relationship or a family relationship, how much more true is that in a larger civil society? Okay, so just maybe one or two more points and then we can take some questions. When you think about what's the kind of civil society you want to live in, we've been talking about that. Another way to think about this is poison in, poison out. It's a recipe. It's what you're doing in the kitchen when you're preparing the meal has everything to do with how the meal turns out. So if you're not putting in good ingredients, you're not going to end up with a good meal. So all these different analogies I'm just trying to throw out there to help us understand what constructive program really is about. It's not the end justifies the means, but the end is already embedded in the means. And that's what Martin Luther King was getting at when he said, be the peace that you want to see. It's a very famous statement that comes from him. It's been repeated by many other people. Live now the peace that you want to see enacted in the world. Okay, so let's stop there. I did briefly mention rule of law. We've talked about how civil disobedience is the selective disobedience of unjust laws and not the disobedience of just laws, because we want to live in a society in which the rule of law prevails. And so we're not going to violate that and then later try to reinstall it. So, Sheridan, last time you brought up that picture of those students in the Nashville sit-ins, that particular form of civil disobedience was great because, first of all, those kids were selectively disobeying unjust laws, and that's good civil disobedience. But it's also a constructive program because if you just think about that image, those kids were living in the moment a civil society. They were living and enacting a society that was based on just laws. So every time we are disobeying unjust laws, at the same time we are presenting and offering a street theater of what a just society looks like. Okay, let me stop there and see what questions you've got.
Yeah, sorry, I'm looking. I didn't have that one.
That's okay. I think everybody remembers that picture. They haven't seen
Okay,
it
so
before.
Elise has a question.
Mhm.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay, great. This is a quick kind of a point and a question. I don't know, I'm sure you all are familiar with the Ezra Levin and Laz Thursday call from
Yeah, from Indivisible.
from Indivisible, and I know that they have worked, at least the time I listened to, directly with Timothy Snyder, expert on authoritarianism, who wrote on tyranny, on the phone from Canada. So I I feel like there's maybe an alliance between the research and the the ER doctor. I kind of feel is like that, maybe those calls and like how meeting the moment, and the research is what they're doing in Canada right at now because they've moved there. Um, so um, so maybe that might be something. Would that be an example of what you're talking about?
yeah, I think so. There are a lot of people who criticized them for doing that, and so we can't all leave. Well, we're not all going to leave. In fact, there are many people who can't leave. So, but I think the mistake there is to assume that one person's action is a prescription for everybody, and that's not true. We're a community. We have different gifts to bring to the mix, and different responsibilities and different kinds of call. So I have no objection to those folks moving to Toronto. They need to have the relative safety of those environments to do their work. They are
Yes.
researchers and writers. And so I'm grateful for what they're doing. I'm not going to move to Canada. That's not my vision. It's not what I want to do. I'm sticking it out here. Um, but I have no objection to them moving. So yeah, I think that's a good point. And then again, I think the medical analogy works because we don't want to we're not all ER docs. We're not all called to do that. Yeah, okay, so here's this image, it's civil disobedience. They're disobeying unjust laws. They're suffering the consequences of that because the system doesn't want to change. That's a fundamental rule of systems. Once you start changing the rules of the system, it pushes back hard, trying to get you into what we would call a change back. Uh, don't rock the boat. Change back to the way things have been, and that's why we get all this repression. Is because it scares people to change the rules, and so they're working overtime to get every people to change back. So this is civil resistance. It takes a lot of courage. People get hurt in these systems because the systems are working so hard to revert to form. This is also a constructive program because look what these kids are doing. They are living a just society. just while they're sitting there, they are simply living into one feature of what a just society looks like.
And so for people who might not be aware, this was because lunch counters at Woolworths and other stores would not allow people of color to sit at the lunch counter. So it was a big department store and they had a lunch counter. And so one of the things to me that is so important about this, you can see Dan has talked about the importance of having a marshal. The guy on the right, I wasn't there, but he to me looks like a marshal, which is a person that has studied strategic nonviolent action, and he's there to, in his own way, without being violent, he's protecting those women. If those guys were going to do anything besides pour soda on these ladies' head, which still makes me cry to look at it, and I think those ladies were crying, but he is there in a protective stance. Meanwhile, all these guys are doing what they do, and these people who are protesting, they practice this for months. They literally practiced having people slap them, their own friends, people that were part of the movement, pouring things on them, jerking them around. They practiced how to not react. So it's really huge that we don't react, because when you react, you give the authoritarians reason to crack
At
down
11.
more on
I'm
you.
going to
So yeah,
lunch.
please
She's
keep your
rescheduled.
audio off if you're, I gave everybody the means to unmute yourself, but please don't unmute unless you're about to speak. So it's 10:44. I'd like to move on
I
to,
was using the wrong pin number.
okay, I'll just go back and mute everybody. But Pamela, if you'd like to go, you have your hand raised.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me, Sheridan? Okay,
Sounds
great.
good.
So when we attend, marches and rallies, one of my big concerns is, are we getting coverage in the media? And I realize that social media has really taken over or filmed a vacuum, or when it comes to people seeing what's going on with the movement. But I still think that the local news coverage is really important for people to understand how many hundreds of thousands, even millions of people are marching across the country on, these specific days, like with Indivisible. So what do you think is the best way to get those reporters out on the streets? Because I feel like when we marched in Atlanta on April 5th, I just didn't see a whole lot of coverage. And it's not like I'm watching the news every second of the day, but it does feel like it's just been relegated to like a sideline issue, when I think the goal here is to make it the issue, right? Like the people are marching,
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the media has changed dramatically in since the 60s and 70s. And in those days, there was a lot of emphasis on print media and television media. And so movement organizers would send out press releases in order to alert the press that a certain action was going to happen. And then maybe the media would show up and maybe they wouldn't. But things are vastly different now. We do want the print media there. We want television coverage if we can get it. But there's so many other avenues that if you're not aware of them, you can think you're not getting coverage. I think we're probably getting more coverage than we realize, even though the major news outlets may not be covering it. Let's face it, news organizations are profit-making industries. They're not really there to be advocates for social justice. They are there to make money. It's more the alternative presses that are, I mean, they have to stay alive too, obviously, financially. But those folks are more driven by the social justice concerns. And so, sure, read the New York Times, connect with the major news outlets, but don't shortchange the alternative media that's out there.
Yeah.
I hope that you all have looked at those resource lists, because there are some online reporting organizations that are doing a phenomenal job. I hope that you will all look at wagingnonviolence.org. They're every week they're coming out with new articles that are incredibly helpful. So if you're not familiar with that source, then check it out.
Also,
But
I want to say most people now get their news from a smartphone and on YouTube and Facebook. So individual folks making their videos and uploading them and then using the @ or # with indivisible or some other kind of strategic nonviolent as a catchword, those things really matter. Okay, Sean, I'd like to recognize Sean. Has your hand raised?
Hi. Lots of people are isolated, which is a potential resource for coalition building. How can people find others working in their area? And two, is there a temporary equivalent to leafleting?
by isolated, you
Go to
mean,
indivisible.org.
yeah, if by isolated you mean that they don't have access to internet and that sort of thing?
No, isolated in that they're not plugged into an ongoing organization doing active resistance.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say be creative. I mean, unless somebody is really completely isolated and they're not involved with any community at all, that's a different story, obviously. But most people are connected to communities somewhere: church, synagogue, mosque, local community organizations, school boards, PTA, anything that where people gather are potential places to connect. So, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. How do you reach people who are isolated? Well,
Unless you signed up online for one of the movements,
So
which no activist would ever do, although I did, you don't get those emails. You don't get informed of where the next things are. It's not like the local newspaper has PTA meeting Wednesday at 7 and demonstration on the green at noon.
okay, I appreciate you, but I'm trying to take people in order that have raised their hands. So thank you. But so Kath Leonowitz?
Yeah, hey, I wanted to hear some examples of bottom up power building, just because I think it's a little bit unclear, and maybe that would help us recognize those actions in our communities.
yeah. So I think one of the best places to recognize it is in your immediate environment, and you can scale up from there. The processes are essentially the same. It's simply a matter of scale. So what about at home with your family? What about in your neighborhood? What about with your friends? Most of us really are not involved in systems where we're either exercising or submitting to power over models. Most churches and synagogues don't have a power over model. Some do, but it's there in plain sight. It's mostly just a matter of learning to adjust the way you see, and or so you say, oh, there's an example of it right there. I mean, even our kids are good at this, right? Children are great at finding ways to have some power in a family system where all these grown-up people seem to hold all the power. So it's there, it's in plain sight, just learn to see it and then scale it up.
Awesome. Thank you. I'd like to recognize Tim Mins. Yeah, you'll have to unmute. You should be able to unmute yourself, and I'm trying to let's see. Tim?
There we go. I have done unmute. Sorry.
Okay. That's good.
This is my first such call and my first participation in an event like this. So thank you for the time here. And it's a bit of a coincidence, Dan, that my first time here, and I have something that I think is beneficial towards the power from the bottom. And I just want to say real quick that 115 years ago, Congress decided that it would fix the number of representatives at 435, which is in direct opposition to what the original creators of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights wanted. The original Bill of Rights had 12 that were voted and passed by Congress at that time. One of which became legislation, which is now that lawmakers cannot raise their own pay. The other one that was passed by several states was that the proportion of the representatives would rise with the Congress, which they did up until about 1910 or 11. If we did have the proportion that they suggested, Dan, we would have as many as 8,000 congressmen nowadays.
Yeah.
And I do believe that this is why we do have a power vacuum in the Congress and the Constitution and the government. Because we do not have the representation from the part of Congress that is supposed to represent the mass of people.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, I think that really, I think what you're saying here goes to the underlying issue, which is the rule of law. It's worth really stepping back and thinking about that. We codify these things into law, but laws change, and Congress can change laws. They can amend the Constitution and so on. And so stepping back and having a look at the rule of law and why it matters, and don't we all really want to agree to these things, and in reinforcing that in the public consciousness is very important, because the rule of law by itself doesn't have any power. It has power to the extent that we support it and encourage it and believe it and want to stick by it. So even if Trump wants to suspend habeas corpus, if he wants to challenge the 14th Amendment, if he wants to challenge what's already codified into law, he can get by with that unless we, the people, really insist on saying, look, rule of law is what we have agreed upon as the bottom line of how we want to live in this civil society. I don't know if some of you read Heather Cox Richardson this morning. She was talking about habeas corpus being established in the Magna Carta in the year 1200, before which kings had absolute power. And with the Magna Carta, even kings began to be subject to the rule of law. Okay, that didn't work unless we are all going to be on board with it. So we'll talk about that more next time when we talk about nonviolence as simply another word for democracy.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to recognize Monica.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just wondering, how can we strategize? How can the strategies of the 20th century, which you've held up as examples, work for a radically different 21st century, where wealth and power are concentrated in an extreme minority that does not believe in the values of democracy, and their basic value is to win and hold power at any cost. And when we have all of the differences in technology, journalism, etc., and most people these days can barely even afford to live on 2 jobs. I think we have a very different reality when we look at this from a Gen Z perspective. I'm a parent of Gen Zs listening to what they're saying, and I'm not sure if they would really even understand what you're saying. I understand it and value it, but I'm afraid that that it needs to be updated somehow for the realities of what we're really dealing with right now. That's been happening for the last 20, 30 years in terms of our institutions crumbling.
Right. Well, that's obviously a very important and crucial point. We do live in a very different world now than the way things were in the 60s and 70s. All true, absolutely. And the main point I think I really want to emphasize, and you kind of have to really stretch to get there, is there are fundamental rules that are just embedded in nature, really, about how power systems work, regardless of the particular manifestations of the power, whether it's concentration of wealth, whether it's devolving from democracy into dictatorship. Those are all very shocking and frightening developments. But underneath all of that, the fundamental rules of how power works, that's pretty stable. Unfortunately, it's a hard sell. People don't see it. They've not been taught it. They don't think in those terms. And so that's the reason why I do what I do, is I'm all about teaching nonviolence, because this model of bottom-up power is something that really doesn't change over time. And that's why learning something about the history of nonviolence is so helpful, because you can see examples where even brutal dictatorships were undermined. Consider General Pinochet in Chile. That was a situation that was changed through nonviolence. And there are lots of examples of that. So yes, situations are frightening these days. You're right. There's a concentration of wealth flowing upward. We have a very different landscape where social media is concerned, a different culture in many respects. And young people didn't grow up in the same culture we did. All of that is true. All of it's very, very important. But I think that the fundamental dynamics of how power works hold across systems and across generations.
Awesome. And we're right at 11 o'clock, so realize if you have to hop off, thanks for coming. Indivisible, we the people, we will still get through this. Ezra Klein's, and we'll take some more questions, but Ezra Klein's latest podcast was questioning whether or not Trump is winning, because he's not shutting down. He's not able to shut down our voices. We raise our voices. That's one of the ways authoritarianism wins. If you're afraid to raise your voice, hence the protest being nonviolent is so critical. And people don't like him, and he cares a lot about that. So so if you need to go, thanks for coming. We have one more. I will send out a Zoom an email to everybody who's ever signed up for one of these, and you'll get the Zoom recordings, and you'll get the resources. So in our last bit here, I'd like to recognize Mari, who I think has been with us on our previous 3 classes.
Sheridan, thank you, Mari. We want to get to your question, but before we do, Sheridan, I just want to comment on the point that you just made. I think that model that you brought up of the guy pushing the rock up the hill is very relevant to what was just said. And that is, if you think about what it's like to be behind that rock pushing it up, you can't see anything except for the rock. That's all you can see. And so it's very easy to get fearful that we're not getting anywhere, it's not working. Trump and his minions are just keep on doing what they're doing and even escalating, and we can get discouraged. Well, the reason we're getting discouraged is because all we can see is the rock. But if you have a bigger model than you can, and you have an understanding of nonviolent strategy, you start getting your bearings from a bigger picture. Okay, sorry, I needed to insert that. Okay, all right, let's hear from Mark.
Yeah, I do appreciate that, because we do hear from a certain amount of people that go, well, where's all this leading? What good is this gonna? That's fine. But what I want to say to them is what you just said. If you don't understand where this is going, you're not understanding the fact that you can do work a strategy to the goal. And you don't worry about the fact that all you can see is the one step you're taking now, or the boulder inch in front of you. So I'd like to, so Mari, thanks for waiting.
I just wanted to say that I know a lot of people are afraid. I have a small circle of people that I try and get them on Indivisible and move on, but they are so afraid they don't want their emails or address or any information on the computer. So then they all come to me to let them know what's going on. And I just feel kind of overwhelmed because we're all elderly. We don't all do internet and all that stuff. So I'm just wondering, is there a simple source where I could print out kind of the latest stuff that's come out, or Can anybody help me with that?
Are you talking about resources that could help folks who are afraid?
Well, yeah, they don't want to get involved at all. They said, we just would like it if you gave us the information. And
Right.
it's kind of a taxing on me when don't have that much time to begin with. So I was wondering if there's a place that like just kind of prints out the latest stuff that's gone on so I can keep them informed.
Yeah.
Because they won't go to anything I go to.
Right. Okay. Well, there are actually a number of really good sources of information and hope for that matter. And again, let me just mention wagingnonviolence.org. It's a very hopeful site. So if folks have access to that and they want to bring up some of those articles and look at them, that's a good source of information and a good way to get a perspective on how this is all working. So that is be a very concrete sort of answer to that question. But I'd also like to just step back and say, you know what, people are scared, and let's have some compassion for that. It's a very broad-based movement. Courage is something that is contagious, and it is something that is affected by multiple dynamics. So I have absolutely no judgment in me for anybody who wants to step back because they're afraid. I don't want to push anybody to the front of the line who really isn't ready to go there. So let's think of this in terms of systems and communities and really nurture and support everybody where they are with the gift that they have and the contribution, however large or small it might be. And that, I mean, I would include you in that. You're expressing your own sense of, well, I can only do so much. Of course, we can all only do so much. So let's give ourselves a break from expecting more than what really is in our toolkit to do.
And I want to say also, Mari, I totally get that, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because one of the other Zooms I'm hosting has to do with changing the Democrat message. What would the Dems have to do to bring in people that, for instance, did not vote for Kamala Harris last time, and who we didn't reach and who we're not reaching. So that's just the whole thing. It's really there of people that don't want to get on Zoom because they're concerned about identity theft. Okay, thanks everybody. It's about 5 after 11. I'd like to recognize Christian. Yeah, 5 calls. Bobby wrote in. Please check out 5calls.org. And Mari, that is something that you could. That's a phone call, so you could recommend 5calls.org to people. I don't know. I use the app, but check it out. So
Hey,
let's.
hi, it's Christian. So a little earlier, people were asking about like examples of these kinds of movements that have worked. And I think it's very instructive to look at the early AIDS activism of ACT UP. That was a decentralized movement. Dan brought up waging nonviolence, and there are some really great examples of movements outside of the US that were disorganized. I think particularly the one in Hungary, I think it was, where there was a student movement. And there are real advantages to it being decentralized and nonviolent. But I think the other thing is that people have talked about feeling isolated and stuff, and I definitely feel that too. I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm like comfortable with the phone. I think we have to, and I'm sorry this might shock millennials or Gen Zers that aren't here, but I think we have to bring back calling people, texting people directly. Like, you can't expect just to post something on Instagram and everybody to show up at the protest. Like, people have to really be invited in. And those of us who've been doing activism for many, many years are very comfortable showing up to a big protest or a march. But if you've never been to one before, it can be kind of scary and intimidating. So you know, if you say, hey, I'll meet you 30 minutes before someplace nearby and we'll go together, you know, I found that to be an effective way of getting people, you know, at least getting their foot in the door.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's all very important. And I like the emphasis on kind of mentoring people. If you've been an activist for many years, then you have a lot of experience and you've learned a lot about how it works. And so you can bring younger folks along, or even folks who are older than you, but are not as experienced. So we have to overcome our habits of thinking individualistically and start thinking more systemically. We're all in this together. The other point you made, Christian, that I just also want to pick up on, which I think is really important, is there's so much to learn from history. There have been so many movements for liberation, and you're referencing the ACT UP. There was so much history there that can be drawn upon for those of us who are working in the 21st century and against Trump. So just a wealth of information. Somebody earlier said, yeah, but this is the 21st century, not the 20th. It's 25 years later, et cetera. All true. And yet there are certain principles that endure across time. And so we can learn a lot from looking at what people have done in the past. So thank you for that.